Hi, everybody. Bill Hannings here, and welcome once again to the Craft of Gaming. This is going to be episode 5, and in this episode, I'm going to be talking about playing to make other people heroes, playing to raise other people up. But the first thing I'd like to get out of the way before I talk about that subject is I'd like to apologize for why this episode took longer than it normally does to post. I had a house guest, and entertaining them took priority. Also, I literally wasn't in my house for any period of time to get things written until today. On the plus side, I saw Bastille live and went to the Art Museum in Philadelphia, both things I highly recommend. And speaking of things that I recommend, there's a LARP coming up which I really wanted to talk about. Lost Colonies LARP is having an event from September 27th through 29th in Sabelesville, Maryland. You can find Lost Colonies LARP on Facebook. I have nothing but kind things to say about this game. It's run by a friend of mine, Joan Hines, and staffed by several other people I have good working relationships and friendships with, including Rebecca Hines, Larry Weil, Andy Randolph, Evan Hodges, and one of my best friends is the rules writer there, Jason Feldman. They have created a particularly ethically run and inclusive Boffer LARP with a fine community and a living rules set that is being updated and reevaluated constantly. Now you may say, okay, Bill, that's cool, but what is Lost Colonies about? And this is a complex answer because it's a different sort of concept one I haven't run into before. So I'll try to give it my best description. It's a game of exploration and adventure that is specifically not alternative history, but rather a fantasy, a fantasy world that isn't really related to our own. Like, this isn't like just like fantasy England. The clothing is basically, in terms of garb, the kind of clothing you'd see from this 13th to 17th century in terms of approximating the look and feel. One of the signature characters in the promotional artwork is an orc in a red coat, and I feel like that's pretty representative of where they're going with it. There's a ton of content, both combat and non-combat, and the production values on the creatures and encounters are very high, and they have a very creative staff and art direction with what they do. And the great part about this is because there's so much non-combat content, it's all important. And even if someone like me, who's an inveterate stick jock and who grew up on Conan, Elric, and Lord of the Rings kid, and I'll say, hey, this is really good non-combat content, that's important. So I do recommend this LARP. But I also want to cover something else. One thing I want to briefly say is what Lost Colonies isn't, which is to say it isn't a replaying of the colonial oppression of our own history, replete with slavery, racism, and oppression. That's not what Lost Colonies is there for. This is much more like fantasy Star Trek exploration and examination of a mysterious new world. It is in no way a big simulation of colonialism as a LARP, and honestly, I'm a little upset when I hear a member of the wider LARPing community use that dismissive phrasing. This video endorsement is an attempt to push back at that. The lore and rules have had sensitivity readers and readings and editing, and the staff is probably the most LGBTQ plus and friendly that I've seen in general at any LARP. I really do recommend it to those that are trying something new in the LARPing community, and I really want people to go and check it out. It's very different in a positive sense, and while I've only managed to make my way down south for episode 0, I actually drove their rules officer down. I'm fully intent on coming again at some point in the future. I hope some of the viewers will join me or comment on this video about their impressions of the game. I'd love to know what you guys think. Also, you get to use some Nerf guns as well as Boffer weapons, and as a goon, this is always enjoyable to me. Another thing I'd like to quickly add is they do an excellent job with how they cater the food. the ticket prices do tend to be a little higher than your typical $50 a month buffer LARP, but there is a reason for that in terms of what kind of food is provided, and the accommodations that they provide. I would also like to mention that they are very open and transparent about how the money of the game is spent. They actually put up reports indicating where the money is going, which is something that I've not always seen with various LARPs, and I think it's a trend I'd like to see continue in the community. So now, with that extended and non-sponsored plug aside, I'd like to talk about our subject today here on the Craft of Gaming. Once again, it is making other people heroes. So this is a big one. As I've said before, and as we mostly already know, LARPing and tabletop games are creative hobbies. So making other people into the hero is a big deal, because otherwise you're just playing by yourself. Now I'm going to quickly go over some ways you can do this. Number 1, know your fellow players. Now obviously this is both an in and out of game consideration. Know what the character and player goals are, and as much as you're able as a player, enable your fellows to get them. Now I'm not saying warp your own characterization to do so, but if you see an opening for someone else, and you can find a justification for your character to pass the baton on to them, by all means do it. Knowing the character in game also helps with this, as you can figure out their things that they're suited for that not even the character themselves or the player might be aware they'd be good at. My friend recently suggested an unexpected and awesome choice for the Chancellor of the Exchequer at Night Realms, and it turned out to be quite an inspired idea. And I'm very excited because it's going to allow a player who has maintained a steady, quiet, reliable presence a chance to make a much bigger splash. So the second concept is sharing spotlight time. Listen, I know that we all love being heroes and badass or cool or just generally getting attention as role players. Role-playing by yourself or without much in the way of an audience is more or less just reciting a monologue or writing something only you can read. While this is absolutely rewarding for some folks, in the end we are inherently a social hobby. So figuring out how to share your spotlight and when you can and should make other players get to the fore is a great thing. This is especially rad when you can do it with new players. Recently at the Star Wars LARP I frequent, I was able to get a first game player a cool badass moment as I asked him as an engineer to help blow up a droid piloted walker we were fighting. He did a fantastic job, and I could tell it was a highlight for him because he talked about it to me later. Secret time, I also could have done that myself because of how my trooper was equipped, but I had already done some neat stuff and knew it would make his day. In tabletop, you can also do this. Know when your friend is confronting their character history villain. Make the choice to fight off their minions if their character intends to go solo toe-to-toe with their enemy, or help them out directly if they make a big goofy shonen speech about how the power of friendship is going to let them win. Kind of look to the player who is most engaged with and connected to a climactic plot encounter for cues to understand how to raise them, and sometimes yourself, up. 3. Know when to make your contribution. The last LARP I was at, we were rescuing a child who was stuck in a weird biological support tank, and there wasn't a whole lot I, as a trooper, a character spec for combat, could do until the engineers and other characters started cutting her out, at which point I walked over and contributed a knife so they could roleplay the final removal of the hoses that were stuck into her body. It was a very brief scene, but it gave them a role-playing tool and had a cool moment of me being invested in that scene. So know when to make the contribution, and it doesn't always have to be a big thing. You can just hand someone else a prop sometimes. Now, number 4, know the setting. I can't stress this one enough. If you know something where another player or character can have a cool scene or make themselves useful and known, point them in that direction. Especially if they look to be in an impasse or sitting in you're in or at the table alone and not doing much, it'll make them feel valued and considered and give them grist to continue moving forward in their own role play. Number 5, we get to NPCing. Now, this isn't much of a I'm not really doing this series for GMs. This is more for LARP players, tabletop players of various games. So this is very specifically about like LARP NPCing. If you're playing an NPC role, you can play to lift the players by giving it your all as everything from a skeleton to a gloating big bad who's about to destroy the universe. Just keep the insults in character and not on out of character aspects of a person, like they can't change, like their appearance, that sort of thing. Just don't say anything that would be rude to say someone in real life about how they present themselves. If you're able, do research on what motivates the people you'll be antagonizing, so you'll better know how to push those in-game buttons without overstepping to out of character boundaries. That's very important. I should be clear. Don't use your research or out-of-game knowledge to have your NPC say or do things that isn't then the brief for them, but use these understanding of the larger themes of those player characters to play each scene to how their ideas and their particular traits will best shine. Like if you know a character is like really protective of others, make a point of in character threatening other people in front of that character. Or, if they're like a witch hunter or something, play up the fact that you're like a spooky demon. That kind of stuff. Number 6, trust. Listen, sharing this spotlight and playing to lift may feel like you're going to be overlooked. And while that does sometimes happen, people tend to remember the considerations others show them, and will more than often than not reciprocate when it looks like your time to shine in a game has come. Build a positive relationship of trust with your fellow players, and you'll almost always have a good time. At least that's what I've found. Number 7, wait your turn. I'm going to admit, this one's hard for me. I tend to talk over people sometimes, and while it isn't ill-intended, and it's definitely an outgrowth of ADHD and my own like hyperactive, excited nature, it's something I need to work on, and I work on it constantly, but it's helpful to remind yourself to do it. Waiting your turn in most games of tabletop RPGs is simply the rules. We have initiative rules for a reason, but it also applies in large conversational scenes when you're LARPing or playing tabletop and there isn't an initiative score. Try to make sure other people get in words and hold forth on their own ideas before you respond. Enthusiasm is great, but be careful you don't turn it into a steamroller and squash someone else's story or character ambitions or goals if you can help it by listening. So, we've talked about knowledge, when to be quiet, but in the end, all of this comes down to listening. Take an interest in other players and other player characters' goals. Even if it's just a passive, quiet interest, it still shapes you. It still helps you shape your own roleplay and interactions with the game world in the best possible way, where you're benefiting not only your own story, but that of others as well. Now, after these instructions of what to do, here's a quick caution about what not to do. Don't entirely neglect your character's wants, needs, ambitions, and motivations to raise up other players. If you have goals and opinions as your PC, make sure that you're able to portray and convey them when the time comes, or in a scene where, people are opposing. This doesn't necessarily have to be adversarial, but make sure that they know that they're out there, so at the right time, they can give sort of attention to what you're bringing to the table. If nothing else, so that people will know what to ask of you or how to support the character when the time comes that might be something that needs to be done. And with that, I think that's a pretty good short introduction of how to play to raise others. There's a lot more I may say about this later, but this episode is fairly long already, so I'll just by signing off by saying I love y'all, and that there'll be more content on Friday. Like and subscribe if you'd like some of that, and have an awesome week. Bill out.